Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our monthly webinar series out of the governor's office. It's February, but this is actually our first webinar of the new year, so we're excited y'all are joining us today. And today we're going to be having some folks from TABC. We have Executive Director Bentley Nettles with us, Major Ronald Swenson of the Special Investigations Unit, and we also have Nick Raymond here, Director of Government Relations, for some support. Throughout today's webinar, we're going to hear about TABC's #1 priority, which is eradicating human trafficking in TABC licensed establishments. And we'll also hear an overview of the agency's initiatives, programs, and partnerships that are essential to that mission. During the course of the webinar, we will have your lines muted just to make this run as smoothly as possible without background noise, but you should have access there on your screen to a chat box and a question box. If you want to type in any questions during the course of the presentation, please feel free to do so. We'll check for those as we go, and we'll also reserve some time at the end of the presentation to get to those questions. And because I know this will be one of the questions, yes, we do intend to record and archive this webinar if you need to go back to it. So assuming that our technology cooperates, we'll have that available for folks after the presentation. So with that, let's just dive right into it and we'll get started with TABC. Thank you, guys.
Great, thank you for having us. Thanks for everybody online joining us. A lot of questions we get and kind of talk about what TABC does in this area because I was just out talking to industry yesterday and there are still people out there that don't realize this is one of the agency's priorities. So our overall mission, we are a regulatory and enforcement agency. There's some 55,000 permitted locations within the state of Texas that we oversee. Our focus is to help businesses and to help protect Texas communities. What we are doing in human trafficking isn't a surprise. One, it's of course one of the governor's initiatives. The legislature in the last session gave us additional funding to take on this task and additional resources. But all in all, it's always been one of our focuses because if it's happening in one of our permitted locations, then that's a challenge. So of the 5 businesses where human trafficking typically occurs, we regulate 3 of them: bars, restaurants, and some hotels. And of course, all businesses, they want a level playing field. It's really difficult for businesses to compete with a business that is gaining some of its revenue or resources through criminal activity. And what happens then is the legitimate business then sometimes fails and only the illegitimate or the subterfuge business survives. And that empowers criminals to do other things in our Texas communities. So that's one of our big focuses of how do we make sure, focus on the business to take away that as a cover or resource for human trafficking. Of course, we don't do this in a vacuum. We're not big enough to do it in a vacuum. We collaborate almost every activity we do in human trafficking. We collaborate with our law enforcement partners, DPS. We work on task forces. Of course, we're in Houston with HETRA. But the majority, the main issue is this isn't a problem that any single agency can solve, and certainly not the TABC. So while our agents are very good at undercover operations, they almost always, when we go into arrest or close down a location, we bring in our other task force partners who are uniformed to make sure everything's done and everybody's kept safe. Ron?
So this is Major Ron Swenson with Special Investigations. This is a unique investigation that we worked with Bexar County Sheriff's Department recently down in San Antonio. And it came about, just as General Nettles said, through our networking and sharing of information with other law enforcement agencies. We have an SIU agent that sits over at the TAG, the Texas Anti-Gang Center, which is basically just a facility where law enforcement is housed together and shares information. And through communication and conversation, basically there at the TAG Center, he heard about a situation where the Bexar County Fire Marshal had gone out and had done an inspection at an unlicensed SOB, sexually oriented business. Bear County SO went out there with them, and they came upon an underage female who was with the suspect you see in the picture there, Eric Taylor. She was found to be a runaway out of North Texas, and she was taken in for being a runaway. The subsequent interviews showed that it was probably human trafficking, and that she had been working at some other sexually oriented businesses around the San Antonio area. When our agent heard that, obviously now it has fallen into our purview because she's being pimped out of these sexually oriented businesses. So we got involved and worked hand in hand with Bear County Detective Unit, and actually we flew up to the Amarillo area and were able to identify additional victims where what Eric Taylor was doing was he was basically fishing online looking for women, mostly underage women, teenage girls that were runaways, were posting things online that were becoming, showing basically that they were at risk. And then he was buying them Greyhound bus tickets to come down to San Antonio, where he was then basically had a little group of girls that he was trafficking out of these different sexually oriented businesses. By working together, we were able to identify Blush Show Club as one of the primary locations that had the most egregious violations, and we were able to conduct an independent investigation and look into their activity there, where we were able to get enough evidence that we were able to cancel that permit for cause and for human trafficking for cause, which means that another licensed location will not be able to go in there for 1 year. One challenge that we did encounter was literally almost the next day they opened up as a BYOB location. So that is something that our executive staff is looking at, kind of closing that loophole so that we can ensure that when we shut down a bad actor, they don't just circumvent the process and reopen up. But this is a good example. This case is still ongoing. There's other establishments, other victims that we're working with, but great example of where putting our law enforcement people in one room, one building at the tag center, sharing information. If we hadn't been there, we might not have known about this, and we were able to take a bad guy off the street and close an establishment that didn't need a permit to sell alcohol.
I know many of you are aware that human trafficking is one of those crimes that tends to hide in plain sight. Unfortunately, we're battling a public misperception that this sometimes is a victimless crime, or they don't want to get involved, someone else will report it. So in order to try to bring more awareness to this crime, we've been working with the governor's office, Ms. Abbott, and the Can You See Me campaign, and then of course the Attorney General's campaign, and Be the One. And we took those and created complementary campaigns and focused directly at our industry partners in order to bring awareness to those that are working in the alcohol industry. It's important, and it's really helped us in a number of ways. Let's go to the next. One of the things we started looking at is, like most regulatory law enforcement agencies, we don't have enough resources to cover the state of Texas. Even though we have 48 locations across the state, Texas is big and has a lot of people in it. So we started looking at who in our external stakeholders would share the goal of eradicating or dismantling human trafficking in the alcohol beverage industry. So we came upon the idea of beer truck drivers and alcohol delivery drivers. So in the retail tier is where most human trafficking is, we find it occurring. It's one where the 3 of the 5 businesses where this happens are located. So we were able to reach out to our industry partners, the wholesale beer distributors, and provide about a 30-minute block of training for their beer truck drivers. Now, the unique thing about beer truck drivers is they go out to locations almost every day, depending on the need, depending on the demand. But they start off at their warehouse at 5:30 in the morning. They load up and they go out and make their run. Most retailers are used to them coming in. They don't give a second thought about that. So they'll come in. Sometimes they're retail employees, sometimes they're not. And typically the business is closed to the public. So they see things that when my agents or other law enforcement folks go in, they don't see. So this has been a way of extending our resources for the agency, but also get external stakeholders who are interested in the same thing we are, and that is eradicating this from the alcohol beverage industry, engaged in helping to solve the problem. So as a result of this, the awareness campaigns with the governor's office and attorney general, and then the beer truck drivers with industry, we've seen some tremendous results. Since 2017 to 2019, we've had a 175% increase in the number of human trafficking allegations or complaints that came into the agency. Of those, when those came in, we then turn around and run investigative operations, and that's what Ron and his folks do. But as a result of that, we've had a 92% increase in the cancellation of permits or the right to do business in Texas, effectively closing down 20 operations or 20 businesses during 2019. So that's been a significant impact to the criminal enterprises, and we're very proud of that. But we didn't get there without the assistance of a lot of our external stakeholders, and I know a lot of y'all out there that are online. So thank you. One of the things, success sometimes begets success. We've had a lot of other folks come and ask us how they partner with us in order to help raise awareness. Everything from the Texas Restaurant Association has 45,000 locations across the state of Texas. And then, of course, the hotel motel workers, even some of the convenience stores. They're a little different than going into a bar or restaurant, but anytime we can raise awareness, then we're reducing the ability of traffickers and to operate, because we drive them out of the daylight and into the night, and then reduce the area they can operate in. So anything y'all can do to help us expand that, we greatly appreciate. As a result of these investigative operations, and we go out and find human trafficking, and we rescue victims, we are not equipped and are knowledgeable of the services that they are available to them. So we partner with NGOs, social organizations that can help them get the services they need. And because we work all over the state of Texas, obviously we need those contacts all over the state of Texas. It's unique. Some folks don't work in certain areas, some do, but we work everywhere. And so if you're a nonprofit or you help provide these kind of services, I would encourage you to reach out to us. At the very minimum, we would like to create a list so that when that happens, we can pick up the phone at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and we have somebody that needs assistance. We can get them your contact information or get them to you. I think that's the next slide, isn't it? So one of the things we've also been able to do as a result of these relationships building with victim advocates and victim counselors out there is, while we may rescue a victim one night, the victim counselor will talk with them over the next 3 months, 6 months, trying to get them the services and information so they can break free of this modern day slavery and get away from their trafficker. That also sometimes gives them information about where they've been working. And that's important to us, because if they've worked in one of our permitted locations, then we want to go and investigate that. In fact, these relations have led to some very significant ability for us to go back in and figure out a pattern or trend and go and investigate bars. And that's what Ron's going to talk about next.
So this investigation I'm very proud of, and I think our team down in the Valley did a fantastic job. It's a prime example of I mean, it's a textbook case of how I think TABC can really affect human trafficking. Now, it was a long-term investigation, and it's still ongoing also, that we've identified, one victim, as the general said, sometimes leads to other victims. But in this case, this was Rita's Sports Bar down in the Mission area, down in McAllen. And what was really unique about this was the NGO Refugee Services of Texas. We had established pretty good working relationships with them here in Austin, and they also have offices down in the Valley. And they reached out to us and said, "Hey, we have victims that have come forward and made outcries. And as most of you know, probably the hardest part of investigating human trafficking is that most of the victims do not self-identify. So when we get a victim to identify and say, yes, I was a victim, that is a home run. And in this case, they had 4 of them that were saying, hey, we've been trafficked out of this bar. The evidence was already there, and for law enforcement, that's awesome. We still had to go corroborate all the information, still had to do our investigation, which took us on many rabbit trails and expanded into more victims, more investigation. But this case could not, the emphasis here is that it could not have been done without our networking with the NGOs and how important that relationship is. Rita Martinez, we hit her house with the search warrant. Her house was actually on the same premise as the bar where she was pimping the girls out of. Her son was a Texas Syndicate associate gang member. He was kind of the enforcer. He would beat up the girls if they didn't show up on time. The problem we had with this case, we actually took it down to the DA's office and we met with the border prosecutor unit, and our statute of limitations had run out on some of the trafficking charges, so we had to think really outside the box. And thanks to the border prosecutor unit for thinking outside the box, and we got Rita and her son indicted on multiple charges of aggravated sexual assault of a child, and we were able to, and 1 count of human trafficking that fell within the statute of limitations. The neat thing about this is we canceled that permit for cause. No alcohol permit will go back in there for at least a year. She and her son were indicted and in jail and probably facing federal charges. FBI is looking at doing a superseding indictment for all the other victims that have been identified. And another tool in our toolbox was we went ahead and said, you use this property during the commission of a felony and we're going to take it from you. So we're working with the Hidalgo County DA's office for asset forfeiture for the house and the property. I think when we TABC are able to hit somebody with those 3 hammers, the administrative, take away your permit to sell alcohol, put you in jail, and take away any ill-gotten gain proceeds that you got through your criminal activity, we can really make an effect. But thank you to NGOs in this situation. Of course, our other partners, FBI, DPS, Hidalgo County DA's office was huge in this. But this is really a textbook case that we're still working, and I'm really proud to say that we got some bad people off the street.
Before we move to the next slide, this is Nick Raymond. Ryan, I was just wondering, could you kind of paint the picture when the law enforcement partners and y'all were going in, not only to the facility, the license location, but where it took you to their homes and what you were seeing there?
Sure. Well, the son lived off-site in a trailer. It's probably I've been a cop for 25 years, a little over, and has worked some bad areas in El Paso County. And I tell you what, I've never seen anything worse. There were small children there. It was just a filthy living conditions, and that was turned over to CPS because of that. The houses that were on site where the bar was, literally, you can't see it in the picture there, but the house is off to the right. It's nothing fancy. She was not living extravagantly or anything. She had what she kind of rented out as apartments in the back. I don't think they're up to code. If they are turned over to us, we'll probably have to bulldoze it. It was not the greatest of living conditions. There was another house where she had actually, nowadays with human trafficking, a lot of the force, fraud, or coercion is not force. It's a psychological force. I'm gonna hold your paperwork, and I'm gonna call Border Patrol if you don't do what I tell you to. But a few years back, when Rita was in her heyday, she was actually holding girls at an off-site location, a residence, and we had, in interviewing these girls, they had described being held in a house and literally under lock and key and kind of yelling at the neighbor like, hey, help us. And when we went over there, did a knock and talk at the house and said, now it's being rented out to somebody unassociated, but we were able to gain access to the house and look, and sure enough, the exactly what they described was still there. And it really hit home that, these girls, even though this information was almost 10 years old, it really hit home that what these girls were saying had happened, was true, and we were able to prove it and show that, Rita was truly holding those girls against their own free will. When we worked at actually some operations that we were in there, she was still in the business. She was trying to smuggle people. She wasn't out of the game at all. What I find unique about it was Rita actually, if you were to meet her at the local convenience store or the restaurant, she just looks like a nice little old grandma. When we hit her house with the search warrant, it was a soft knock, and she came out, and I thought she was going to offer us coffee and donuts. She was just the nicest old lady in the world. But behind that nice old lady is a really, truly an evil person who I truly hope spends the rest of her life in jail.
Appreciate that. Yeah, just wanted to elaborate a little bit on that.
So I know all of y'all know how to report suspected human trafficking. You probably aware of some of these, 911 if it's an emergency, and of course the national hotline. We get some referrals from the hotline, but if you think it involves a alcohol business, I encourage you also to either call the local TABC office, or you can download our mobile app and you can make a complaint anonymously. We just need to know where you think it's going on and when it might be going on so that we can go and take a look, because we have both administrative and criminal jurisdiction. So we have the ability to walk into any alcohol permitted location, inspect the premises, ask to look at the books, talk to the employees, and talk to the customers. Now, of course, if we think there's criminal activity going on, then we will follow normal criminal procedure to make sure we get subpoenas and search warrants. But we can do a whole lot just with an open inspection by one of our auditors. They're plainclothes wearing individuals, but very knowledgeable about the business. So anytime that you think that there might be something going on in a location, and the reality is about 60% of all human trafficking occurs in some nexus to an alcohol beverage industry. And that can be as simple as, where they're doing the business in a hotel or back of a bar, back of a restaurant, or they may be going into convenience stores to clean up, to freshen up. They may be going to grocery stores to buy groceries for where they're keeping these girls. All those are permitted locations which we have jurisdiction over. So if we get a tip, we can go look at video. We can try to find out where the victims are coming from, try to establish patterns so we can go help rescue them.
So this is just a really good example of some of the social media stuff we've been putting together. This went out, I believe, last week, and it's being used as a tool not only for social media but for other engagement and community involvement. Having a national hotline on there and the app information, this is kind of a flow chart of what to expect if we get a complaint, going out to those areas, doing the investigation or inspection to start. If we determine something's there, work with our locals, state and federal agencies, and ultimately, if determined, pull their license or their permits and shut them down and seek criminal action against them. But like Rita's example, this usually leads to more investigations, and it's been extremely helpful. So we have this posted on Twitter, on our Facebook. You're more than welcome to share it. I know when I shared it with my community, a lot of them wanted to either repost it or individually get it to their local constituents, family, and friends. So.
And finally, here's some contact information for us, for y'all. I will tell you that although we've had some successes in combating human trafficking, continued and future success will depend on y'all. We rely on our industry partners, we rely on NGOs, all to help us not only help these victims when we get them rescued, but to help us with tips and where to go look. My folks are really excellent at doing undercover or plainclothes operations, but there's no way we have the resources to cover 56,000 locations. So if you think that something is happening near you or in your community, let us know. We live in these communities too, so we want them to be safe. Our industry partners want the alcohol beverage industry to be criminal-free in Texas because they don't like trying to compete against someone who's not playing by the rules that they are. And we don't want this horrific crime to continue, and the only way we're going to stamp it out here is with everybody's help. So,
Well, one thing too, Major Swenson and myself participate for the agency at the Prevention Task Force and at the Coordinating Council. So if you're not familiar with either one of those, the leadership in Texas has put those together through 2 different sessions, and ultimately fighting it and developing a 5-year strategic plan. And if you have other partnerships that need to be aware of that and can call and make suggestions, that's always welcome. So.
Thank you guys so much for being here today. I'm hoping this was very informative for folks. Just a reminder to those of you on the webinar that you can use that question box there if you have any questions. We have some extra time here at the end to get to those questions. I'm going to start us off with just a little bit of conversation to give folks a chance to type in if they want to there. I guess you all talked about this a little bit, but you mentioned quite a bit how essential partnerships are to you, relying on service providers and other folks to be able to do your job well. And I was hoping maybe you could sort of talk just a little bit about the flip side. You know, why is it that TABC is such a critical partner to others? What is it about your jurisdiction or about the tools that you bring to the table that you're such an important partner that local law enforcement and others need to know to be able to tap into?
So I can tell you from our perspective, I think we're a great partner. And the main reason why, we have a wealth of knowledge. So let's say you have a local convenience store. We know who the owners are. We know their bank account information. We know who the employees should be in there and probably who shouldn't be in there. We know if they own other locations. And primarily that's because being in the alcohol beverage business in Texas is a privilege. It's a privilege extended by the state. So everybody that gets into that business has to apply. They have to provide us that information. And then industry as a whole has to provide us a lot of information so we can do our job of enforcing the alcohol beverage code. The other thing we typically know is what alcohol drinks are going into that location. If we compare it to the comptroller data, often we know what's being sold there. So we can bring a wealth of knowledge that's available to our local law enforcement partners, and that administrative jurisdiction that we have, that's unlike another law enforcement agency. So we can do, and what we have done is gone in with an inspection and brought in other law enforcement agencies undercover so they could have a look around without having to get a probable cause for an inspection or investigation.
Yeah.
So
I think Major Swenson made the point that we want to hit you administratively, criminally, send you to prison if you need to, and also hit you in the pocketbook. So it sounds like having you all at the table helps make sure we don't miss any of those pieces.
We want as many tools in our toolbox as we can possibly get, and we are a valuable tool in their toolbox, whether it's another law enforcement agency or an NGO. The example of Blush was a local sheriff's department needed some of they have limited jurisdiction, their county, but we have statewide criminal jurisdiction too. So we were able to go with them up to whatever county Amarillo is in and interview these girls. Now, they could have, but it helps to have that statewide, that state police authority with you. In the case of Rita's, the NGO needed assistance, and we were able to provide that assistance because they're doing all the victim services parts and getting, all of the legal stuff in line for the victims, but we were able to come in and add to that and supplement and then also make that criminal case. One thing that makes us really unique is our special investigations unit. Specifically, we several years back, we saw that there was a need for very specialized investigations and training, and we broke out a small group of agents to focus on long-term organized criminal investigations, specifically human trafficking, narcotics, money laundering, et cetera. And a lot of, we've strategically placed these SIU agents in different parts of the state. We have a fairly large in Houston, because that's pretty much the hub of human trafficking right now. The city, the county, everybody down there is really focused on that. But we've also put a lot along the border because we know that border security is a huge issue in the state. So El Paso all the way down to McAllen and Brownsville area, we have a group of SIU agents. And then in our metropolitan areas, we also have some in smaller communities, Laredo, out in Lubbock, and they cover those areas that are smaller towns. Recently, the chief of police out in Pecos has reached out to us, and I believe she attended some training that was sponsored by the governor's office about a year ago, and she's reached out to us and said, hey, how can we help her in her area with the oil boom that's going on? There's lots of those man camps going on out there, and lots of the bars and restaurants and motels that have bars attached they're finding lots of prostitution, and are the prostitutes victims of human trafficking? That's what we're trying to determine. Right. We were finding out that unfortunately, there is a percentage that are victims of human trafficking, and that's where we can come into some of these smaller towns. A city like Pecos, they cannot work undercover. Every cop in that town is easily recognizable. Same with the sheriff's department, but we can bring in somebody from El Paso or Dallas, get them into town, and blend in much easier.
Right.
So also, they don't lie to us very often. When, as General Nettle said, our auditors go in, it's a regulatory process. They're not going to lie to us, so they usually give us, if FBI or DPS walks in, a lot of times they know, well, why is DPS in here? You know, why are the Rangers in here?
Right.
Why is the FBI in my bar? TABC walks in, it's not always the red flag.
Right.
So
and sometimes we can help in ways that you wouldn't think. Like recently, we had a case. Was it Arlington? So they had a massage parlor where they thought human trafficking was occurring. They reached out to our agency, although there was no alcohol being sold there.
Huh.
And we were able to determine that the same owners of the massage parlor also owned a restaurant in South Lake. And we determined that they were funneling money from the massage parlor through the restaurant where it was permitted. And we were able to pull their permit and give some assistance to the local police department.
Yeah, I'm glad you shared that, because my mind would have not gone to TABC, automatically thinking, but sure, people own multiple types of businesses. Looks like we have somebody's question here. My old eyes. Are there any grant opportunities between TABC and anti-trafficking agencies? So TABC is not administering grants, right? But you could talk a little bit about how you partner with agencies. And just before we get into that, because I think they talked about it quite a bit, the governor's office does provide a considerable amount of grants to anti-trafficking agencies. If you're a victim service provider, probably the most relevant fund source that we have is our Victims of Crime Act funds. Those applications are actually open right now, and they're due on February 27th, so just in a couple of weeks. So if you are an agency that provides victim services for trafficking survivors, please go to eGrants. You can find that information on our website. We can send it out, but there's one application open right now for general victim services, and one that's specific to community-based services for child sex trafficking survivors. So definitely look into that if you're interested. And then I don't know if any of you have anything else you want to say about how you partner with those service providers.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we actually are putting one in for a grant to get a coordinator that would ultimately partner with NGOs across the state. One of the challenges that our agents were having is when identified a victim and going into the licensed location and pulling them out and shutting the place down, it was hard for law enforcement to approach the victims and for the victim to feel safe. So we're hoping that through this grant, we get a coordinator in-house that kind of knows the law enforcement world and can work in the SIU area. But when we go out to these jobs, operations, either led by us or jointly in our task force, they would help facilitate the victim with the folks online here to provide the service moving forward.
Right.
So,
and you all mentioned how some of these service providers have already been helpful, say, they're providing services to a survivor who says, hey, as a matter of fact, I was forced to work in that club, or I was exploited in that location. Is there anything that any of our service providers on the line who haven't worked with you all before need to know about that process? If they find that out and they want to make a report, is the survivor going to be expected to then participate in an investigation, or what do they need to know about how that will play out?
Well, it's it's going to be varying degrees on what they want. Of course, we welcome any type of complaint. If they want to remain anonymous, they've already gone to an NGO and they're receiving victim services, obviously, and they don't want to be identified or interviewed. That will be very, very helpful, and I don't want to discourage that because that's great. But obviously, the more they cooperate, the more we can interview them and then corroborate. Like if interviewing those girls and them describing the room that Rita held them in, and then us going there and seeing the room, and that says a million words when we have the evidence to take to a judge and say, here's exactly what they said here, and it's true. We also can help with T visas and U visas. We have done those. Now we have to vet that. We have to make sure that that's it for our international trafficking victims. Blush was more of a domestic trafficking. She was a U.S. citizen. She was underage. Rita's were international trafficking, where Rita was actually smuggling these girls in, telling the parents, hey, I'm going to put them to work, and then she was putting them to work in her bar. And so some of those girls, we were able to help them with T visas and U visas, but of course that does require a level of cooperation because that goes up through the federal system and gets signed off on. So.
And I'm glad you mentioned that about the minor in the club, because I think a lot of folks don't realize that even though there may not be that final commercial sex act, we do have statutes around employment harmful to a minor. So regardless of whether that additional transaction took place, if you are working with youth and kids that have made any mention of working in those clubs at all, it's going to be a cause for concern whether you think it rises to the level of trafficking or not.
Well, and of course, although we're focused on human trafficking, anytime we get a complaint, if we think an industry member or business is a bad actor, we will pursue other violations, and because our goal is to shut them down and get them out of business. So please just make the complaint. We'll try to work with you, and we'll find a way to go kick these folks out of your community if at all possible.
We're going to give it just another moment in case we have any other questions on the line, and I'll wrap up my questions here, and that might be the end of it. I love law enforcement. We cut the fluff. We're straight to the chase. But I think General Nettles, maybe you mentioned some of the new funding that came through this session, and I think a lot of people don't realize that TABC was one of the first in the state working these cases before we had task forces around the state and before any agency was getting specific funds for it. But is there anything you can say? I know it hasn't been long, about how useful that new appropriation has been. Is it the specialized investigators that you're talking about that you've really been able to beef up with that? Or
so you're right. Since 1935, this agency has been charged with keeping organized crime out of the alcohol business in Texas. So we've been doing it for a while, but the additional funding has certainly helped. We've brought on a criminal investigative unit that will help us provide analysis. Currently, when we get a complaint in and our folks go out and do an investigation operation, we are averaging about between 25 and 30% success rate in shutting them down. With the new criminal investigative unit, our hope is to get that up to around 50 to 60%, thus using the taxpayer resources that we're given more effectively. And the other thing is just getting out the word, helping to facilitate focusing on our industry, helping to train folks, identify it so it can't hide in plain sight. That's the biggest challenge. And unfortunately, as I know a lot of the folks online know, some of these victims don't really see themselves as victims. So it becomes a challenge. They may be afraid of law enforcement. They don't want to cooperate. They may not see themselves as a victim. So therefore, they don't put the pieces together. But I know that y'all see them and y'all know what the issues are. So all we need is a pointer in the right direction so we can know to go look at one of these locations. But the appropriation, of course, just started in September, but we're doing I think a lot of good things. We've almost doubled the size of the Special Investigative Unit, which brings it to a total of 50 agents, which isn't that many to cover the state of Texas. But we're focused on the major metropolitan areas where a lot of this tends to be occurring.
Yeah. I want to be sure that folks recognize that just because that funding is new, this issue is not to you all. I think it's a recognition of the work you've already been doing it and the need for the resources there. So
yeah, the additional funding has been invaluable because these cases are not easy to solve. We used to work a lot of drug cases, and drugs are dangerous but somewhat simple. If you have a Kia Coke, you sell that Kia Coke. You got to go. The drug dealer needs to go get another Kia Coke. But if you have a human, you can sell her and resell her and keep reselling. So it's very profitable to traffic people, whether it's labor or sex trafficking, whether it's domestic or international trafficking. But what we're finding is that these cases are not as simple as the drug cases. So those are simple cases, but they are easier to prove because you're not dealing with the human element. The Rita's case, it has spiderwebbed into Houston, Chicago, and that's why we had to get the feds involved, was to help with some of the logistics on just tracking down some of these victims. And so the funding, back to the funding that we got, without that funding, it would be very difficult to exhaust all of those leads. And really that's what we as a law enforcement agency want to do, is we want to exhaust every lead, overturn every rock, find every bad actor, and hopefully eradicate human trafficking or disrupt it and dismantle it enough that it leaves the alcoholic beverage industry. That'd be the end game.
All right, let's see. We have another question here before we wrap up. Does TABC have any sort of online database that local law enforcement could use to perform searches for possible licenses held by people or at specific addresses? I read that kind of awkwardly, but it sounds like if local law enforcement is wanting information about who holds a license at a location or getting address information, how should they go about that? Is there a searchable database, or do they need to contact their local TABC partner?
So it's always better to contact the office, but I'll tell you the app that you can download, the TABC app, you can put in your neighborhood or your zip code, and it'll show you the permitted location. So you can also use it to find where to go buy some alcohol. So it's useful. It's useful for a lot of different reasons, and that's how consumers can put in complaints if they're at a bar and there's some kind, they think they're not being served the product that they ordered. That's a violation of the code.
But
Ron?
There's also on our public webpage, there are links. It sounds like it's a little difficult, but it's really not. You just click on the button that says I'm trying to find data. You click on that, it takes you to a deal. And you can enter in the street address, and what that'll show you, it won't give you active complaints, but if they've been administratively found guilty of any administrative violations, to include human trafficking on the administrative side, it will show up. You can see who the true owner is. If it's an LLC, it's not going to give you the shareholders and all that good stuff, but it will give you contact information. It'll give you a lot more information than probably what Google will give you. And that is on our public webpage. And I actually, when I teach law enforcement, I have some slides that show it. It's not hard once you know where to look, but maybe if you don't know where to look, I think sometimes people have trouble finding it.
Yep. We're going to see if we can pull it up so folks can see what their website looks like there.
Complaint.
The human trafficking video right on the home page, the landing page.
The other side, you just verify.
So if you want to create a list for your area, if we want to just pick, you want to know bars we'll do Travis County. This is the process to currently do it. We also got additional funding this last session to make our website and the user experience a lot more transparent and easier. But ultimately, you'd put in your location right here. If we did all counties, we'll do Travis. We'll do Tarrant. Anyone's up in Tarrant. And we'll do Fort Worth. All zip codes in Fort Worth. You're going to submit that. it populates up here. You'll return to the back page, and then you'll say, I want to see all active licenses, meaning they're operating, they're licensed to do so. And if you want to go to all licenses, you pick this. If you want to, pull out mixed beverage or beer and wine, for this example, we'll just leave all licenses. And you can go to summary page. You picked it. Oh, I do have to pick it.
I think when you hit back, you went back. Put it.
So we'll do retailers. So that's like your, well, we'll do all.
Pick BG.
Beer, wine. So these are premises that sell.
These are your hole-in-the-wall bars. I shouldn't say hole-in-the-wall bars, but they don't. They're your bars that
just sell beer,
just sell beer,
wine, and then you submit it. It's going to open up in a PDF. You can have it sent to your Excel though, and this will have location, status.
58 pages of those types
There
of
you go.
license
That's
locations.
Tarrant County, Fort Worth.
And there are some of these particular permit types, right, that are impacted by the trafficking hotline signage and
Sure.
that sort of thing as well, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I guess my only other question, because it's been mentioned a couple of times about contacting your local TABC office or using the mobile app, what's the best way for people to either find that app or get the number for their local office? Is there a listing somewhere they can get that? Or is
The app is probably the most user-friendly. Obviously, if it's human trafficking and you think somebody, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but if you think somebody is immediately in danger, we still say call 911.
right?
If you think it's something that you need to report, the Polaris 1888 number is always a good form. But we really would like you to call us directly if you think it's something. If you're a service provider or another law enforcement agency and it's not an emergency, we would really like you to reach out to us. You can go on to our public webpage. It has a link of all the district offices. My number was up there, 3301, 206, 3301. Don't get me wrong. If you call it, sometimes I'm not sitting right there just answering the phone. Shoot me an email.
Mine as well. Call and email.
But the district offices are those phones are answered Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and we will get you to our enforcement division for that area, and they will get you in touch if it's a specific human trafficking type of investigation with our special investigations unit. So we highly encourage you, if it's a licensed location and you are, it's not an emergency, please reach out to us.
They should be able to just search TABC when they're in their app store, and that should pop up for them.
TABC Mobile, I believe.
TABC Mobile. Excellent. Well, we're getting right near the end of time, and it doesn't look like we have any more questions. I want to thank you guys so much for being such excellent partners in the state, for everything that you do, and for making time to be with us on the webinar today. Like I mentioned earlier, we will have a recording of this available if people need to go back and pull up Major Swenson's phone number or whatever needs you might have for it, or folks that weren't able to join you on the call today. I did want to make a quick plug that our next monthly webinar for March is going to be on March 12th at 1 p.m., so the same time. We'll be sending out registration information so that you can sign up for that one. We're going to be doing a case study on a familial trafficking investigation. So Sergeant Lundquist with Waco Police Department is going to be joining us for that webinar, talking about family-based trafficking and doing a case study. So I want to thank you all for making time to join us today, and hope to see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.